Good day, beloved. And you'll know that's a Pauline expression. And those of you who've hung in from last 2 days to this day are truly beloved, at least by me anyway. You recall we're moving through the book of Judges, and we've tried to determine why during this period of time Israel was stalled or stayed or inhibited in their spiritual development. Now, in chapter 1, we discovered that one of the reasons was they tried to hire out their own spiritual development. They didn't want to do it themselves. They wanted some professional to look after that on their behalf. I think chapter 2 brings up a second aspect of why they were stalled in their own spiritual development, in their own entry into the program and purposes that God had for them in terms of achieving the promised land. And the second is in chapter 2, as you might suspect, and verse 10. And it says there, after that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now, there's a fair bit of detail in that, but let me simply say that there grew up another group of people who didn't have a personal experience with the Lord. They weren't there when God's almighty power delivered Israel from Egypt. They weren't there when Joshua came into the land and God sent hornets ahead of the Israeli army to win a battle. They weren't there when the walls of Jericho fell. They weren't there when hail came down to defeat the enemy. They weren't there when God prevented the sun from advancing and the moon from advancing to give time for the Israelite army to get to the Gibeonites. They just weren't a part of experiencing what God had done in miraculous and interventive ways in their own personal history. And I think perhaps that's one of the things that seems to deter us from making progress in our spiritual development and in following the program and plan and purposes that God has for us. We don't have that personal experience of an individual God. My son-in-law just recently wrote a book called Stay. And stay is actually an acrostic for spending time alone with Yahweh. And in that whole process of spending time alone, what happens, we eventually, if we persevere, we experience the presence of God. We gain insight into reflecting upon the ways in which God has intervened through the presence of His Holy Spirit in us and through the work of the Holy Spirit in the history of the world in which we're involved. And it is those times that give us a real sense of the very real presence of God, give us an expectation that God will be involved in our own destiny, and in the process of that, our own development in relationship to Him. Well, we've carried our measuring tape to day 3 here. So let me ask, are you spending that quality time alone with God? Are you reflecting upon those areas in which God has moved in your life, God has intervened in your life, God has answered prayer, and God has moved you along in your spiritual development? Are those kind of current experiences, not things that you've heard, not things that somebody else has told you, but things that you've experienced yourself? Well, I pray that as you reflect today and as you spend time today alone with God, that dynamic would be a part of your experience. May God bless you.